Have kind of left you by the side of the road because you don't necessarily see everything the same way as the Christian does. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I sure have. In the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a new tactic that's emerged. It's quite different from Jesus' approach. The new tactic is if you disagree with somebody, you shout, scream, loudly protest, you interrupt, you harass, you do anything to keep the other point of view from being heard. And I believe Jesus' way is different from that. Jesus would welcome individuals to the table for a conversation and would have some interchange. And so that's the approach that we want to take, because we believe that many of the questions that people have about God and about all the things that God teaches us and reveals to us, that these questions are worth beginning to explore. So there was an elderly couple, and they invited their next door neighbor over for dinner. And the neighbor comes over and he notices in the elderly couple the man is being very loving and sweet toward his wife, and he would always call her sweetheart and darling and my love, and so the neighbor said, I just think it's really nice how you refer to your wife with all these loving names. And the older gentleman said, well, to tell you the truth, about 10 years ago I forgot her name and I've been scared to death to ask her what it is. Well, we don't want to be scared to death to ask any questions. So today's topic is just really the most important starting point, and it's how do we know God is real? Because if we don't believe in God, then nothing else that we really talk about beyond this is going to matter. Do you remember the first time you had any idea about God? What was your life situation? What was the setting? The first time somebody told you that there was this all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, everlasting God, what was the setting for you? And I've shared this part of my story many times. The first time I ever heard anything about a God that existed, I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I'd been down the street telling naughty jokes with some of the other kids, and somehow the neighbor lady must have heard us, and she called to the house, talked to my mom. By the time I got home, my mom said, "What kind of naughty things were you telling jokes about?" And I said, "Well, how did you know?" And she said, "Well, there's a man upstairs that hears everything." And I said, "There's a guy in the attic?" That was really what I thought. And she began to explain to me the whole idea about the existence of God. But I think we have legitimate questions. You can't see him or smell him or physically touch him. I think we have questions. What is God's nature? What is he like? Is he like this sort of mythological Santa sort of figure? And is belief in God even something that's reasonable? So I want to draw your attention to just one verse of Scripture, and it's in the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, and it's the 19th Psalm and verse 1, and it was written by an individual named David. Now, David is the same guy that wrote the 23rd Psalm. If you've been to a funeral, you've probably heard the 23rd Psalm. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And David was not just a king. He was not merely a worshiper and had a background as a shepherd, but David was really a visionary leader who brought his place, his nation from sort of the Stone Age into the Bronze Age. And so David had this poetic way of stepping back and looking at things. And in Psalm 19, verse 1, he says something so powerful. It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. And I think that's a great point just to begin, is stop and think about David. Imagine him as a shepherd boy when he was young, out on the backside of the pasture with lots of sheep and lots of time at night without all the other light pollution around to kind of wash out the stars. And he could look up and he could see the night sky. And this idea of literally everything we see talks about or displays in one way or another God, the sky and its beauty above. You might say, well, if God is real, why does he have to just show us these things in the sky? Why doesn't he show us more than that? And I guess one answer I would give to that is because what God is looking for from us is faith. And so the things that we see are really more pointers that point towards God, and God desires us to interact with him by faith and have a certain level of belief. Now, you might say, well, why is faith involved in that? If there's faith involved, then your faith, my faith, they might be different. We don't even know that God really exists. But I would say this, the kind of faith God's looking for is more than just the faith you have when you put money in the bank that it's probably still going to be there. More than just the faith that you have when you go to work that your employer will probably pay you. More than just the faith that you had to get up this morning and believe that there's going to be enough air for you to breathe. The faith that we have in God isn't merely a blind faith, but it's a faith that has a good measure of reason to it as well. So I want to give just a few things that are pointers, things that point us towards God, and I want to invite you to write them down. And it starts with this idea that God is making himself known, but he's doing it in ways that are not direct, but that are indirect, that are pointers towards who he is. The first one is this. The first pointer to God's existence is that the existence of stuff points to God. The mere fact that stuff, scientists would call it matter, but it's the existence of matter, it's the existence of stuff in the universe that point us towards God. Because we have to begin to ask, where did all this stuff come from? The scientific principle is that for every effect, there has to be a cause. And the effect is never greater than the cause. It was just 10 years ago this week that scientists gathered from around the world. America sent some 1,200 scientists and $500 million to this big project of the Hadron Particle Collider that was in Geneva nearby. And so 300 feet below the ground, they built a 17-mile track upon which they shot particles around in opposite directions so that these particles could come together and they could cause a certain kind of interaction and explosion that would give them some type of information or understanding of how the universe all began with this big bang. And the mere existence of stuff raises some important, understandable questions. Where did all this stuff come from? Who caused the effect of all that we see around us? And so I think that's a really fair question. We look around and we see a lot of things. It causes us to want to ask, where did it come from? And the scientists that put together this experiment, you could say that in effect, that we caused the effect and we reproduced this big bang that happened. The problem is really twofold in my thinking. First, whenever humans create, we create out of stuff that already existed. God, on the other hand, created out of nothing. Not only do we create out of stuff that exists, but we also have to intervene in the situation, because the scientists themselves, the individuals who built this incredible machine, they had to inject or intervene by involving themselves. in the entire experiment. So it says to me, the very existence of stuff, who caused it? Why was it caused? How was it caused? If there's an effect, there has to be a first cause. But where did the first cause come from? As one young adult was asking their pastor, with all the hundreds of millions of billions of stars out there, don't you think that there's got to be life on some other planet? Don't you think there's got to be alien life somewhere? And the pastor said, no. And the young guy said, well, then why did God go to all that trouble? And the pastor said, what trouble? The idea is that for God, all of these amazing things are no trouble at all. If I were to take a Bible here, and if I were to hold it and say, drop it, someone would say, well, why did it fall to the ground? What would my answer be? Would it be because of gravity? No, not necessarily. Well, would it be because there was a windstorm that suddenly blew the Bible out of my hand? No. Would it because I don't hold things very well in my hands? Maybe. But the larger reason might be it fell because I caused it to fall. I turned it over, or I moved my hand out of the way quickly. There's this whole system of cause and effect. But who caused the first cause? When Moses asked God, what is your name? God's answer was, I am that I am. In other words, I am the only uncaused being. I always was, I am, and I always will be. Which brings me to the second thing that I think points to God. It's not merely the fact that stuff exists, that there has to be a first cause, but it's not only the existence of stuff, but it's the contingency of stuff. Everything in the universe is contingent upon something else. Everything in the universe is contingent upon something else. For example, trees. Trees are contingent upon sunlight and air. The Husker football team is contingent upon a lot of things. In fact, the entire planet Earth is contingent upon the sun. And the sun is contingent upon really the other planets and the gravitational pull. Everything in the universe, in one way or another, is contingent upon something or someone else. Which raises an important question. If all that exists is dependent, fragile, temporary, contingent, who is responsible for all the dependent objects and things? Who or what? This idea that everything is dependent upon or reliant upon or contingent upon something else brings about a lot of interesting philosophical arguments. And because I don't remember all the philosophical arguments so well, I'll just give you a broad concept. Take, for example, the idea that you have ideas in your head. Now, these ideas are not material or measurable, so where did the ideas come from? And say, for example, you have an idea that an all-powerful, all perfect being exists. Well, to say that you have an idea that a perfect being exists is greater than the idea itself if the perfect being exists. So therefore, if the perfect being exists, which is greater, then the idea is lesser, therefore the perfect being exists. In logic, they would say that's logical. To me, that's really complicated and hard for the mind to totally get and totally embrace and to wrap around my head. The universe, though, is contingent upon a lot of things and functions as a whole. And so if I were to draw a big circle here, and if this big circle right here, if you and I could zoom out far enough and say that this big circle represents everything in the known universe, time, matter, space, ideas, values, planets, solar systems, nebula, everything in the known universe. If it all exists within this circle, and if it all has lots of causes and effects, do you think that the initiator of everything in this circle came from inside the circle of contingency or outside the circle of contingency? Well, it doesn't take very much logic or reason, which must have also come from outside the circle of contingency, to conclude that everything that exists must have come from something that's outside the circle. What could possibly be outside the circle of everything, if not God? In fact, you could take it a step farther, and if you say God, let's call God this big circle right now. If this circle represents everything there is to know and do and be, how much of that circle do we understand? Maybe just a little tiny bit of it. How could it be possible for us to, with any kind of authority, say that God, who is greater than our ability to conceive, doesn't exist if all that we know is just a tiny little fragment of all that can be known? That makes the idea of atheism impossible, because atheism says there's no God at all. But I believe fair skeptics can ask questions, and God continually says, look at the sky, look at the stars, the heavens proclaim his glory, and the skies the work of his hands. Leads me to a third thing that points to God, and it's this. Not only the existence of stuff and the contingency of stuff, everything depends on something else. Not only the unity and all that, but the probability of stuff. The laws of probability make this discussion about the nature of God and who he is and what he created, make it really interesting. The vastness of the universe astonishes me. When I try to just conceive of the size of the universe, it just blows my mind. It's larger and bigger than we can conceive. And I've talked about this on end over the years. If you've been here before, if you're brand new, let me just share. I love looking at the night sky. I love marveling at the vastness of the universe. The probabilities involved in a universe coming together and operating and functioning as it does are just mind-boggling in every way. In fact, if you look out and you see something that's a star, or if you look at a picture in a magazine that looks like the sky and there's a star, sometimes what you think is a star isn't merely a star, it's an entire galaxy far beyond the scope of your eyes and your imagination. As I think about all of this and probability, and I look, could it have happened by mere chance? Hey, Charlie, would you toss me one of those down there? Yeah. Thank you. Do you ever know how one of these came into being? Long time ago. Longer than that. And it continually gets longer and longer. That there was this great little pond, and it was just out there somewhere, and out of that pond a rock began to fly and tumble through space, and that rock got larger and larger until one day there was this incredible explosion, and that explosion created all different kinds of matter, and from that matter bubbled up this little brown bubbly sort of chemical, and over time that chemical eventually became very sweet and tasty. And then while that chemical was floating through the big nothingness, all of a sudden, this metal, this aluminum stuff began to form, and it began to form around the brown, sweet-tasting chemical, and it was so bubbly, and then that metal began to develop in time, a top and a bottom, and then it began to develop this pull tab on the very top. I don't think I'm capable of even opening this, which is probably a good thing. And then one day, this blue and silver and white paint stuff began to tumble out of the sky, and it landed directly on this little piece of aluminum with this delicious, tasty, sweet, brown, bubbly substance inside. And the letters began to form, and it said PEPSI, which must stand for something extraterrestrial, and it all happened, and it has a top to open it with, and it all happened according to probability by itself. And that is how it came to be. Joe, come take this, catch it. I'm going to throw it, and if you don't catch it, we know what happens, right? I didn't toss it, did I? Imagine how preposterous that whole thing sounds. How can I give reasonable explanation to something that happened with the probability being zero, that all came together? How much more the complexity of the universe? What are the odds that something this simple and useful and tasty, and is it still tasty these days? How possible is it? What is the probability that could have happened by itself? Well, your conclusion and mine are probably the same, that this all points to somebody intelligent and good at marketing and creative and kind and generous that created it, which leads me to the fourth pointer to the existence of God. And that's probably my favorite one. And it's the design of stuff. The design of stuff. Intricate design presupposes an intricate designer. So if you were to look at something as simple as a can of Pepsi, you'd say, somebody designed that. Somebody put that together. Now, it might say on the side of it, manufactured by the Pepsi-Cola bottling company, or Pepsi-Cola company that puts all these things together. And you might look at that, like some people look at the Bible and say, well, you're just putting that on the side of the can. That doesn't mean it was really created that way. But rather, when you step back and you realize all that God created points to God. Wow, how reasonable it is, how simply reasonable by the faith that God's given us and the understanding that God's given us to conclude that there is a designer that put these things together. And that just warms my heart. Do you know that in the study of the sciences and mathematics, there are a number of formulas and constants that have been developed. For example, the speed of light. That's been able to be measured. There are other mathematical and properties of physics in chemistry. There's the gravitational constant. There's Planck's constant. There's the mass of every electron, proton, and neutron, which is able to be measured to a precise degree. There's gravitational coupling constants, and I won't even pretend that I know any of what any of these mean. But I would tell you this: if all of these things are measurable and precise, and if they operate in a very narrow range of precision, that even a hair's breadth difference on just one of the many measurable formulas that evaluate the number of protons and neutrons and electrons and how they all work together. If there was the slightest bit of deviation in these, life could not exist at all. So the idea that all this is just happenstance without any design is really beyond belief. In fact, it suggests the design of the universe is so clearly evident. You know what it does to me? It suggests to me that it takes more faith to believe there was no designer than to believe there was a designer. And we believe that's the Lord God himself. If I had a banana sitting right here in my hand, boy, I wish I did. You have one for me, Jonathan? You can toss it to me. Thank you. Whew. Don't you love a banana? I eat a banana probably 5 days a week. Anybody else love bananas? Oh, you do? I didn't say I love them. I said I eat them almost 5 days a week. And don't you love them? I just think bananas are really an interesting bit of design. You think about it. The designer made these with a no-slip surface that fits nicely in your hands. Even works well for some other animals that like them. It's really thoughtfully made. Notice that a banana comes with it doesn't say best used by on it, but it comes with its own built-in time-sensitive indicator, right? If it's green, maybe it's not quite ready. If it's yellow, it's probably just about ready. And if it's brown or black, Notice it comes with this nice pull tab on the top. Isn't that awesome? And it usually opens down 3 or 4 sides. It comes perforated for us. Isn't that really cool? It's perforated so that it peels nicely. It's got these ridges. Everything about this suggests that there was a designer. Eat some of that, would you? Ooh, you caught it. But yeah, the other interesting thing about that, every one of those comes with its own built-in reproduction seeds. And the other thing about it is it's environmentally sound because it's biodegradable. And you just think that's just a banana. What about when you get to the complexity of design that's in something like a cell phone? And imagine all of the pieces to a cell phone just tumbling out of nothingness into something and being such an incredible piece of technology that the technology that gone into putting one of these together was more powerful than the best computers that were used to put humans on the moon's surface. Suggests to me not just a cell phone, but what about a human cell? What about the cells within your physical body? Listen to this statistic. It says the odds of a single protein molecule forming by chance is 1 in 10 to the 243rd power, which is like a 1 with 240 some zeros after it. The odds are so astronomical, and then that's just to create one protein molecule. And then if you recognize a single cell is composed of millions of protein molecules. Do you understand the complexity and the design and the perfection with which you were made in your body, having lots and lots and lots of cells? I want to read a little bit from the Bible in the New Testament. It's in the book of Romans chapter 1. And it says this. It says, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky." It says, "Through everything God has made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, So they have no excuse for not knowing God. It says, yet, yes, they knew God. In other words, they realized, yeah, God probably exists. But it says they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became fools. He's saying that, look out, look around you, look up at the sky, look at the other incredible things that God created around you. You know down deep in your heart that these things were created by God. They were created for you, for your sustenance, for your enjoyment, for your pleasure, because of the incredible, over-the-top, grandiose generosity and grace of God and kindness of God towards all of us, his creation. But it said that man, they sort of knew that, but didn't really want to worship him as God. So let's not do that. Let's come up with these other concepts and ideas and material values and worship those, in a sense, value those higher than we value the one who gave us the very life in which we live. We can see the hand of the designer everywhere, and I see it everywhere. But do I really want to accept him as my designer? Sometimes we decide not to accept God as our designer, creator, because we don't want to worship him or have our lives, our morality be accountable to a holy God. And that's probably where many people are today. That might be where you are this morning. Maybe you're saying, I don't really want to submit myself to a God, so I choose not to believe in a God at all. Which leads me to the fifth and final pointer that I will give towards God this morning. By the way, next week, we're going to talk about the Bible, and if you have somebody that has some doubts or is skeptical about the Bible, or maybe you have them themselves as really being a message from God towards humans, I invite you to bring friends next week who might have questions. Invite somebody to come, and we'll talk about it. So the fifth one is simply this. The pointer to the existence of God is the uniqueness of humanity. The uniqueness of humans that God created. Also in that New Testament book of Romans, it gives us a biblical understanding. And for if nothing else, if you don't believe the Bible yet at this point, at least listen to the way the Bible describes how we are to think about these things. It says, when outsiders who have never heard of God's law follow it more or less by instinct, they confirm its truth by their obedience. In other words, there's something that God created uniquely inside of us as humans that points us towards God, that points us towards a moral way of living. In fact, every culture on every continent throughout history has had some type of laws that govern the moral behavior within the various clusters of people from an anthropological perspective all over the planet. And this unique nature of humans is that humans have this moral code, if you will. Nobody has to tell you murder is wrong. You know it by nature. No one has to tell you stealing is wrong. You know it by nature. And that's what this verse in Romans chapter 2 is saying. In verse 15, it says about people who've never even heard of God's law, they follow it. In the next verse, it says, they show God's law is not something alien, imposed on us from without, but it's woven into the very fabric of our creation. Woven into us. God put this in our human DNA, that we would have certain moral codes. Humans uniquely are conscious. Humans are uniquely self-aware. We know that we exist. And unlike other beings such as animals, birds that fly, the bees that buzz over our head, humans, we're We're self-aware. We know that we exist. Humans were uniquely given this sense of creativity. God gave us creativity because He's the creator, and because you are made in God's image. To think that I'm made in God's image and I have some of that God stuff inside me blows my mind that God would even do that. But God made humans as the crown of His creation. As beautiful as the sky is and the mountains are and the oceans are, God made humans the crown of His creation. And He made us uniquely like Him. You know, humans uniquely value beauty. I don't suppose that your dog or your cat values beauty in the way humans do. It's more evidence of the unique nature that God has placed inside each and every one of us. And He's given us all these senses, and each of them have a design and a purpose. You don't taste things with your ear or smell things with your eye. God has given you senses, and by these very senses, you can live out your days. Pastor TJ, if you'd come on back to the platform at this time. Humans have this uniqueness in a desire to seek immortality. As long as humans have been around, there's then been this desire that's really been woven into us by the designer to want to live forever. And I believe that desire to be with Him forever might not be something on your agenda or your plate right now, but God designed you to want to live forever. Why do we try so hard to live in this life? The Bible tells